What if there was a way that you could use triggers to your advantage? That's exactly what I'm going to tell you about in this video. Hi, my name is Valerie. I'm an intuitive energy healer and spiritual coach, and I help people who have experienced childhood trauma to transform from surviving to thriving. Because I myself have made that journey, and I am happy to show others some of the tricks I've learned along the way, maybe help you avoid some of the mistakes that I've made. So, how do you turn triggers into triumph? First of all, I want to talk a little bit about triggers. The word trigger has kind of worked its way into just the common language. 20 years ago, before people were as familiar with the ideas of PTSD, trauma-informed care, there's been so much growth in understanding and knowledge and research about this in the last decade or two, which I guess is a good sign. It becomes people are becoming more aware. What I'm talking about, though, is not like somebody says, when they say, oh, that really triggered me, they're really saying that upset me. There's a difference here. I'm really talking about post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. This is a clinical diagnosis. Now, not everybody who has suffered trauma will go on to develop symptoms of PTSD or complex PTSD, but it's also my belief that most people at some point in their lives will experience some sort of trauma. If you go on to develop trauma symptoms, triggering is the big one. I want to distinguish here between two different kinds of triggers. PTSD is generally associated with a specific traumatic event, maybe an assault, you witness a murder, violent crime of some sort, maybe a natural disaster or war, but usually of a specific event. And getting triggered is when something literally physically triggers a reaction, a response in you. One of the things that's coming out of the research is how trauma actually changes our physiological makeup. It rewires the way our brain works. And so healing from trauma and trauma recovery has to do with working to rewire and fix what's broken as far as physiologically. We know about brain plasticity. We know you can rewire your brain and forge new neural pathways. What's happening when someone with PTSD is triggered, something in the environment stimulates that part of the brain, and it literally releases the memories that are stored internally in different places in the body, and the person will re-experience the trauma literally. They may visually see what they saw at the time of the trauma. They may hear the sounds that they heard at the time of the trauma. They may even smell or feel the sensations in their body. So it's really like reliving the event. With complex PTSD, that is more when there's a long period of traumatic events, maybe not one outstanding traumatic event, but a series of repeated pattern, often from childhood. A lot of people, there's a misconception that the C in CPTSD stands for childhood, because that's quite commonly how it develops. It begins very early in life. It happens over a period of time throughout the time you're growing up, very often due to a dysfunctional family setting or whatever the setting where you grew up. So what happens is with CPTSD, when the person gets triggered, it might not be as dramatic and it might not be as pronounced. They might see, or for a moment think they see something. They might re-experience what they heard or they felt, but mostly it's an emotional response. The feelings that are triggered and the chemicals that are tripped off in the brain are an emotional response, and it's almost as if you're reverting emotionally to the age at which the trauma occurred. An example for myself is, and I've mentioned in an earlier video, I didn't remember it for a very, very long time. My CPTSD was a delayed onset, and it didn't really start having symptoms until I was about 50. But very early in my life, there was a traumatic event where my parents left me, like the family got in the car and drove away and left me in the park when I was only about 2 or 3 years old, which was very traumatic for a 2 or 3-year-old. Fast forward to age of about 10 or 12, there was a very similar occurrence. I was with my dad. There was no one else in the family. It was just my dad and I. And we had taken his hunting dog out for a run. It was time to go and the dog wouldn't come. We could see him. My dad whistled for him. He called to him. He said, "Kennel up," but the dog just decided it didn't want to. Just like had happened to me when I was 2 or 3 years old, my dad decided to teach him a lesson and put me in the car and started up and drove away. Now, as a 10 or 12-year-old, my reaction was over the top. I flipped out. I bawled and screamed. I like a 2-year-old having a total meltdown. Out of proportion to what was really going on. And my dad was sitting there telling me, "It's okay, we're going to just go around, we'll just go up the road and we'll turn around and come right back. He'll be right back. He'll come. I promise you, he's going to come. He'll be in his kennel when we get back." And sure enough, we drove a mile or two and we came back a couple minutes later and there was the dog in his kennel wondering where we'd gone. I didn't even remember at that point in my life when I was 10 or 12 years old, I didn't remember the event in the park when I was 2, but the memory was stored in my body, it was stored in the wiring in my brain, and I was emotionally triggered, and I behaved like a 2-year-old even though I was 10 or 12 years old. So that's an example of what I mean by an emotional trigger. Okay, so how do you use this to your advantage? Well, as a 10 or 12-year-old, I couldn't use it to my advantage. And this is where I want to kind of throw a warning in there, a caveat. If you are newly diagnosed with PTSD or CPTSD, if you're new to trauma recovery, what I'm going to talk about next is maybe an advanced technique, maybe something that you can aspire to. I want to go ahead and put it out there for you as, yes, there's hope. I, at one point, not that long ago, was actually on disability because my PTSD was so severe. I couldn't work. I didn't work for over a year. But now I feel like I've made a really good transition, and I'm in a place now where I know what my triggers are. So that is the first thing. Before you can transform triggers into triumph, you need to learn your triggers. You need to learn how to regulate your emotions and how to deal with triggers. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. The number one thing I tell everybody that I work with, though, is you should have a good trauma therapist. Be sure that you're finding somebody that does trauma-informed care. How are you going to transform your triggers into triumph? Here is another example. I was talking to my adult kid. They also have had some major trauma in their life, despite all my best efforts. Trauma tends to be multi-generational. That's a topic, I will bring that up in another video. We'll talk about multi-generational trauma, ancestral trauma, and how you can break that pattern, which is another thing that I've worked really hard to do, and it's showing in my child. So they called me up to tell me this. They were so proud of themselves, and I was really proud of them too, that they had experienced a really strong trigger. And it was someone that they really look up to in the LGBTQ community, a public figure. It's a comic, and the subject of suicide came up. And this person told an audience member that why don't they just go kill themselves, that this was a really big trigger for my kid because they have attempted suicide. They lived for many years with mental illness and suicidal ideation. And so this was a really big trigger for them. And they recognized that they were triggered. That's a key point. They recognized that their emotional response was coming from their body, that they could rationally, and this is something that comes with practice, they could rationally detach themselves from their reaction and observe it and recognize, okay, this reaction, this response is out of proportion to what really happened. It's not like it was something that was happening to them. It was something they saw on a video. And so they went home and used their coping strategies, which is another thing I'll be sharing about in videos. I mean, tools, you got to have tools, and not just one. You need a whole tool case full of tools to cope with these things when they come up. But they were able to regulate, they were able to calm themselves down, and they decided that what am I going to do with this? I know that this is hurtful. This is affecting the LGBTQ community of which they are a part. This is affecting them as a transgender person. This is affecting them as a person that lives with mental illness and has survived suicide. And the triumph came that within 24 hours, which is really remarkable, they decided to join an awareness walk raising money around suicide prevention. And they posted it on social media as a challenge and asked people for pledges. And I think the suggested starting pledge was $150. They got $150 in less than, I don't know, it was like 12 hours or something. And by the next day, they had doubled that. And the walk isn't even till September, so they're still raising money. This is an example of how you can take this trauma and transform it and use it for good. Make something positive. It's a favorite saying of mine when thinking about trauma and the trauma response and how you are in the world. How do I live in the world? Is life something that happens to me, or is it something that happens for me? And as you learn more coping tools and strategies, as you learn to recognize your triggers, regulate your emotions, release trauma from your body and from your energy through lots of different modalities. There's energy healing, breath work, lots of somatic work. You get to this point where you can view everything that happens to you as something that is for you. What is the lesson? What is being presented? What is life challenging me to change? How is the universe asking me to step up? One last caveat I want to go back and talk about. Again, if you're early in recovery, don't do it alone. Get a good therapist, have a good support network, learn some coping tools and strategies for processing and releasing your trauma. Don't do what I did. When I was early, literally 2 days after my first flashback, and I had been diagnosed with PTSD, I was reading voraciously and studying and everything I could find online, trying to figure out what was trauma. I had a background in science, and so that was my go-to response was, I'm going to research this, I'm going to figure it out, and I'm going to fix it. And I read something about how every time you're triggered, you're releasing a trauma, which was a gross generalization. But I decided, oh, okay, that's how it works. I intentionally set out to trigger the hell out of myself. And that was really stupid. Do not intentionally trigger yourself to try to work through your trauma. Big error. I landed in the hospital. So I've taken that experience and everything that's happened since then, and I've used it to transform into a life that is vibrant and thriving, and I couldn't love it more. And part of it is helping people who have survived trauma to heal, release, and transform. So I hope you found this helpful. I really appreciate it. If you wouldn't mind, give me some comments down below. Let me know what you think. If you like it, hit subscribe. If you tap on the bell, you'll get notified when I post a new video. It's about once a week. And a thumbs up is always appreciated as well. You can find out more about me and my services if you're interested in that. There's a link to my website down in the description. If not, that's great too. I look forward to seeing you next week. Until then, namaste.